Hi, everybody. Welcome to our next unit, which is called Linear Functions. We are officially starting our algebra course, which is really exciting. So you can congratulate yourself on completing 7th grade math at this point. We are now preparing for next year when you take algebra. So this is really an exciting time. So in our linear functions unit, you guys are going to get kind of an introduction to linear functions, which is really just studying lines on a graph. And that seems kind of simple, but there's actually a lot more to it than what we've discussed in the past. And so today we're going to talk about something called slope. When you hear the word slope, you might think of skiing. A lot of times when people are referring to skiing, they might say, oh, I was on a really gentle slope or a really steep slope. And so when we kind of compare slope to how steep a line is. So why don't we start by kind of putting some bullets here. What is slope? So I'm going to say it's the steepness of a line and there's times when we'll classify the steepness of a line, and we'll talk about that in a second, as like positive, negative, zero, undefined. But typically when we talk about slope, we're going to put a number to it. Okay, so it's not enough just to say, oh, it's a gentle slope, or oh, it's a steep slope. We actually, in math, are going to use a number to describe that steepness. So the way that we do that is we look at how the line changes when we're comparing the numbers on our y-axis to our x-axis. So the second thing we're going to write here is slope is the change in y compared to the change in x. So if you think about y being your y-axis, which is your vertical axis, and x being your horizontal axis, when we talk about the change in y compared to the change in x, it means how far am I going up or down compared to how far am I going over to the right. And so sometimes you'll also hear slope described as the rise over run. So how far do I rise compared to how far do I run? Rise meaning obviously going up or down, and run meaning how far over am I going? Okay, so before we get into the specifics of those last two bullets, we're just going to talk about how you classify slope. Okay, so I have these little ski birds here who are skiing on the different lines. And so our job is just to, looking at the line, classify whether that slope is positive, negative, zero, or undefined. So just like when you read, we're going to read these lines from left to right. So if I look at the first example and I look at that line from left to right, I can see that that line is increasing. Okay, so here's kind of my visual to see that. So if your line is increasing, we consider that to be a positive slope because you're going up from left to right. For a negative slope, again, if you're reading it left to right, you can see that your line is decreasing. Okay, so that implies that it's negative. It's going down from left to right. The next two are always tricky to remember the difference. So a zero slope means that you're basically not going anywhere in the up and down direction. Okay, we're really just going across here. And so when that happens, when there's no rise and there's only a run, we consider that to be a zero slope. And I'll show you mathematically why that works in the examples that we're going to do in a minute. But one way that I remember in school trying to remember the difference between zero and undefined is I would think, oh, I can make this into a z for zero slope. So if that helps you. feel free to use that to remember. And then for undefined or no slope, so you'll hear it called both of those things. I tend to use undefined, but you might hear it called no slope. Basically, this is a vertical line. Okay, so poor little seabird, I don't know if he's going to make it out of this one. He is going straight down the mountain here. So undefined is when there is a rise, but there is no run. So you're basically just going straight down. And again, the way I always remembered this is I would turn that into a U for undefined. Okay, so those are the 4 ways to classify your slope. So if you're asked to classify, those are the ways that you would do that. You would say one of those 4 situations. And so now we're going to talk about how do you find the slope as a numerical value, okay? And so when you're given a line on a graph, it's pretty easy to do this. We're just going to be counting. So I'm going to have you right here. You count the rise over run. And then I'm going to put here rise can be positive or negative. So the reason why the rise can be positive or negative is because from left to right, if your line is increasing, your rise is positive. If from left to right your line is decreasing, your rise is negative. But run is always positive. Okay, so this is important. When we're talking about how far we run, we're always talking about going right, okay? Because when we read, again, we're going left to right. So we're never going to look at how I go left on my line. It's always how do I go right, and right implies that it's going to be positive. Okay, so this is going to make a lot more sense when you guys see some examples here. So let's look at these graphs. So number 1, first of all, looking at the directions, it says classify and find the slope. So remember, classify is tell me if it's positive, negative, 0, or undefined. And then when it says find the slope, that means I actually need a number. Okay, so just looking at number 1, if I had to classify that, reading left to right, that's a positive slope. So that's the first thing I'm going to write here. Okay, so to find the slope, you have to have 2 points on the line. Sometimes they'll be drawn in for you. Sometimes you'll have to find 2 nice points, okay, but you need 2 points. And what we do is we start at the left point. So I'm just going to kind of, this point right there. And I need to count how do I get to the next point. So I'm using my rise over run to do that. So I'm just going to draw kind of in here my thinking. So to get from the first point to the second point, I am going to rise 1 space, and I'm going to run 2 spaces. Okay, so my slope is rise over run, which means my slope is 1 over 2. Okay, so slope many times is a fraction. The top number is your rise, the bottom number is your run. Now this is kind of strange and I'm not really sure why, but the abbreviation for slope is m. So we would say m equals 1/2, or you could write slope equals 1/2, but I'm going to use the abbreviation here. Okay, so let's try another one. Number 2, first let's classify it. So from left to right, we can see that our line is decreasing. So this is a negative slope. Okay, so when we count the rise over run for a negative slope, we are not actually rising. We are actually rising a negative amount. Okay, so I have to go down and then to the right to get to my next point. So when I go down, I'm going to say, all right, I went down 2. That means my rise is -2. And my run would be 2. Okay, so I want you just to take a second and notice the difference between those 2 questions. In number 1, we went up and to the right. In number 2, we went down and to the right. So it's really important that you notice that we never go left. It's always up and right or or down and right. Okay, so for this one, my slope would equal my rise, which was -2, over my run, which was 2. Now with slope, we always want to reduce that. So that's going to be slope is -1. Okay, you can either leave your slope as a whole number, or integer, I should say, or a fraction. We don't want to make our slope into mixed numbers. Okay, so if you have an improper fraction, leave it, just reduce it as an improper fraction, but don't make it a mixed number. One thing I want to show you is some people are like, well, wait a minute, now it's just -1. Where's my rise? Where's my run? Well, if it's just an integer value, remember, to make it a fraction, I can just put it over 1. And those two fractions are equivalent. Now, what's really cool about lines is that, let's say I were to pick this point and this point right here, and I was going to find my slope. Well, if I look, I'm going to go down 1, over 1 to get to the next point. So -1 over 1, which is my slope. So it doesn't matter what 2 points you pick on that line, you're always going to get the same slope. Okay, and I'm going to show you one more just because I think this is so cool. So if I were to pick, let's say, this point here and this point down here, and I did my rise over run. Rise over run would be -3 over 3, and -3 over 3 is still -1. Okay, so again, it's really cool because any 2 points you pick on that line and you find the slope for, you're always going to get the same slope. Okay? All right, moving on, number 3. So classify it first. This is a positive slope. It's increasing from left to right. They gave us 2 points, so let's just go with using those 2, even though, again, we could pick any 2 we want. So rise over run means I'm going to go up 1 and over 2 to get to the next point. So just like number 1, my slope is 1/2. Okay, number 4, classifying it, this is negative because it's decreasing from left to right. And so this is a big one. I have to count my rise over run. So because it's negative, I'm going down and then to the right. So let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 down makes that -5 and over +4. So my slope is -5 over 4. And again, we leave it. We don't want to make that a mixed number. It's just a simple fraction, rise over run. Okay, number 5, so classifying this one, if you remember, when it's a horizontal line, the slope is 0. Now, eventually, I don't need to see any work for this. You can just say m equals 0, but I want to show you why, like I mentioned before. Why is it that this is 0? So let's think about this for a second. To get from the left point to the right point, my rise would be 0, right? My run would be 1. And so 0 divided by any number is 0. Okay, so again, I could have picked like these points here. My rise would have been 0, but my run, 1, 2, 3, would have been 4, and 0 over 4 is still 0. Okay, so it's enough to know, or just to write m equals 0, but that's the mathematical reason behind it. All right, number 6, we have a positive slope. And we are going to go rise over run. 1, 2, 3, 4 is my rise. 1 is my run. So 4 over 1, which is just 4. Okay, number 7, we have a negative slope. So my rise over run is going to go down and then to the right. It looks like I went down 4 over 2. So rise over run, -4 over 2, and I can reduce that to just -2. All right, last one here, classifying the slope. This is undefined. And let me show you why that is. So to get from the first point to the second point, it doesn't matter if you say the top one is the first point or the bottom one. It really doesn't, because no matter what, watch what happens here. If let's just say I'm going to go from the bottom to the top. My rise here is 2, but my run is 0. So anytime you divide by 0, it's not possible. We call that undefined. If you were to put that in your calculator, 2 divided by 0, you'd get an error message, okay? It's impossible to divide by 0. So that's another kind of good thing to remember is if you're struggling to remember the difference between 0 divided by 2 and 2 divided by 0, punch it in your calculator. It'll always tell you either 0 or you'll get an error, and that'll mean it's undefined. Okay, so that is our introduction to slope. Hopefully that made sense. We will continue on in the next lesson with figuring out how to graph our own lines. So stay tuned.